to minimize conflict where possible. Of course, conflicts are met on the normative level in terms of human rights and all this idea of Europe as promoting universal values. On the other hand, there is China, which doesn't really accept, and I think it has a point that says, you know, what you say here is not really universal. We have a right to choose our own model. But anyway, China and the Western Balkans, pretty symmetrical actors. If we frame China before as a regional power with a global outreach, the Western Balkans is a foreign policy actor. I frame them as inward-looking. Too busy with consolidation, they reduce their foreign relations primarily on some regional affairs and double integration in the EU and NATO. I think a very important obstacle that we mostly forget all the time is that many of them were not states before. So they're relatively young players, and they're, of course, very minuscule. They have they have adopted this inferior perception and internalized volcanism, and the result is they're pretty marginal. In terms of size, this is just some data here. As you can see, the whole population of the Balkans is less than the population of Beijing. In terms of GDP, the Balkans, if it was a Chinese province, would be a pretty poor one. Out of 31 Chinese provinces, autonomous regions, it would be somewhere between the number 24 and 25. So that is pretty much about the disparity. Rising China in the Balkans. China in the 21st century has assumed a very proactive international role, and its influence is felt pretty much everywhere on the globe. It's very much involved in development in Africa and Latin America. Australia is dependent on China economically in terms of exporting primarily raw materials. Obama announced the pivot to Asia in order to emphasize the influence China has on the regional Asia-Pacific affairs. It is growingly important in Central Asia, as we'll mention later. And of course, the China-US relationship, it was even acknowledged by the American administration by offering the G2 model, which was gracefully rejected by China. It was a proposal that the US and China form sort of a special G2 platform in which they would jointly decide on issues of common interests. Again, that did not really fit in the Chinese vision of themselves as foreign policy actors. The context in which I think we should analyze China-Balkan affairs, which are growingly important, is the context of China's growing involvement with the they call it Central East European countries, but effectively Central East and Southeast European countries. It's a group of 16 post-communist countries. Those are all the post-communist countries of Europe, without Kosovo, which they don't recognize, but they actively trade with. And aside from the three countries, Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus, which are both considered to be part of the Russian zone of influence, but not so much Russian zone of influence as European neighboring area. It's one thing that the 16 countries have in common there. 11 of them are EU member states, 4 of them in different areas of accession. Now that Albania has become a candidate, and Bosnia as well. So why China looks to these countries? It is growingly, the most appealing argument is it fits in its going out policy, which aims to find new resources markets, and of course to find new projects for its state-owned enterprises. China prioritizes outward flows as much as it emphasizes inward flows with this policy. For instance, the annual outwards investment from China to the rest of the world from 2000 to 2010 grew approximately 70 times, from about 1 billion to 68 something billion. Why in particular this region? How is this region created? If you talk to the Polish people, they're pretty offended. They're put in the groups with the Balkans. Anyway, why this region? First, this region has manifested thirst And in some countries, especially the Balkan countries, this I frame as pathological desire for foreign investment. And I'd like to echo Leon's arguments from yesterday about the need for searching alternative economic paradigms. Anyway, so China needs a place to invest. Well, it needs investment. Central East Europe needs investment. Potential for development that only some have been able to utilize themselves. Again, Leon's argument from yesterday. They are part or port to the European Common Market. Geographically, they are an extension to the Silk Road economic belt, which was announced as a concept in Astana, Kazakhstan, 2013, which refers to the massive projects that China is now undertaking in the Central Asian countries, which are themselves an extension of the China's Western development policy, which is developing Xinjiang and the other Western provinces. Finally, there is Greece, and Greece is pretty important hub for Chinese investments, especially in infrastructure, especially after the crisis, it was mentioned yesterday. Again, this is what the Chinese emphasize, and I know how much the governments in the region are proud. They have the historical ties from the communist days. So, for instance, when they were announcing this cooperation in Beijing, it was followed by exhibition of the history of cooperation between China and Central East Europe, and there you would have also pictures of communist leaders. Actually, those were the majority of pictures. And then they also say they have undergone similar market reforms, so hence they are compatible, they can learn from each other and whatnot. The growing question, especially in Brussels, is does China have political goals as well? Especially with regards to the countries that are EU members. They have voting power in the in the Council of the EU. The countries that are candidate countries, one day they will become members. Will they become China will be in the Council? We'll get to that a bit later as well. And why Central East Europe will look to China? First, of course, China initiated this cooperation, but also China offers a lot of money, and these countries seem to like money, as everyone else. The bonus part about China, which is appealing especially to leaders who are not that convinced in the normative power of Europe, is that Chinese money comes with minimum political conditionality. That means no touching of Taiwan and Tibet, and no discussion of Western-style democratization of China. They don't really care about the domestic situation. They don't really care about what kind of regime you have and whatnot. It's just that you're willing to do business and you can guarantee and you can deliver. Again, are there any political reasons, such as counterbalancing the influence of the West or trying to improve their outlook in the world? I mean, it's an open question, and I think those are probably questions for debates because it's very hard to get answers by interviewing people. Anyway, just briefly about the cooperation between China and Central East Europe. Its inception was at the Business Forum in Budapest, when for the first time representatives of the 16 governments were convened by China, and then the next year the Prime Minister Wen Jiabao at the same forum which took place in Warsaw announced the future platform and announced the so-called 12 measures, which have become the 12 measures policy. This was an initiative again by China, in which the 16 Central Eastern European countries strongly followers. The implementation started right away, as the first point of these 12 measures was establishing a secretariat. The secretariat is based with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and every country appoints national coordinator. So it was established in September 2012 in Beijing, and since it assembles at the highest level at least once a year, with certain other dialogues taking place both in China and in these countries. This in Europe did not really get the attention. As I like to say, EU-China analysts are very Brussels-centric, so this was Warsaw, this was not Brussels. Anyway, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences paper on China-EU relations said that in early 2013 said that this establishing of this platform for cooperation was the highlight of the Sino-European relationship. And Again, in the meantime, all these events, all these smaller dialogues, and the start of other cooperation took place. The concept was refined and deepened last winter in Bucharest with the publication of the so-called Bucharest Guidelines. What would be the next step? By the end of the year, there should be another summit. The speculation is that it might be either in Latvia or Serbia. I'm not sure. It's always secret to the last moment. Anyway, what's the essence of this cooperation? So it's cooperation in various policy fields without dealing with much high politics, as I said. No questions of democracy, human rights, blah, 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 no Ukraine. The most important measures are the special credit line, which is especially important for the countries that are not EU member states, because EU member states have legal obstacles to that. Of course, increasing Chinese investments in the region, opening hubs of Chinese banks to internationalize the renminbi. 6?
No, 5. European.
Anyway, cooperation in the fields of tourism, education, culture, think tanks, exchange, and so on. In the region, the biggest partners are Poland and Hungary, as well as Serbia. I will get to that back later. Poland has the highest trade. Hungary attracts a lot of investment. What were the Bucharest guidelines? It extended this above policy fields with substantial cooperation in transport infrastructure and energy. So it was announced, for instance, they would build a nuclear reactor in Romania, and they announced a lot of transportation projects, the most promising one being the Budapest-Belgrade rail, which is also important in the sense that it will be a cooperation between European and non-European countrymen. I'm half the way. Anyway, they also achieved certain kind of multilateralization of the format from 16 bilateral dialogues to a more regional approach. A case of the success of the China-Central East Europe relationship, I would just mention the Lodz-Chengdu rail. I just come from Łódź, which is a city in Poland, which has, anyway, it has established a direct rail connection to Chengdu. There are also other rails. This relates to the concept of land bridges, which probably we can discuss later. What is the geopolitical outlook? All right, let's get to the Balkans. The history, we can skip it. I mean, it's important actually. Albania was one of the very close allies in the times of Mao, and Yugoslavia had ambivalent relationship with China. And the post-communist experience is also important. If you read, for instance, the statements from Yugoslav media at Tiananmen Square, they were really, really harsh towards China. So they were part of all this international community that isolated China. And later on, China was crawling slowly back. At the time, Milosevic was the only ally of China, which is, authors frame it as a solidarity of rocks, in the sense that China didn't support the sanctions, it didn't vote against them as well, but it didn't really respect the embargoes, so it continued economic cooperation. An emotional moment of attachment was the bombing of the Belgrade embassy. In China especially, it's important as a turning point in terms of nationalism and global outlook. And of course, Macedonia always has to have something. Unfortunately, is the Taiwan adventure, which greatly severed relations with China. Taiwan at that time was shopping for allies. Only Macedonia was brave enough to actually go the full way and recognize Taiwan, which might have had more serious consequences, but nonetheless. So China today sees the Balkan countries primarily as part of this platform. Additional geostrategic value, again, the land bridges, by land bridges I mean huge railway built through Central Asia. Part of it might go to Turkey. We'll see, that depends on China-Turkey cooperation. The Greek ports, the Piraeus port, actually, there is a very good paper by a Dutch think tank, and if you wonder why Dutch, because the Dutch are very worried that after the Chinese investment in Piraeus, this has become very, very, the volume of flow of goods has increased about 3 times, I guess. So that is really a threat to Rotterdam. Anyway, There is another peculiarity, especially for the non-EU member states, that, and this is a fear primarily from Brussels, that China might use investment here to use it basically as a training, how to achieve compliance with European standards, but also to, for instance, secure presence, substantial presence by, it is much easier to secure presence in a non-EU country than a EU country, because in a EU country there are so many laws to be obeyed. Anyway, the added value for the Balkan countries, at least, what I could get from speaking to some diplomats, is that they are actually treated as Europe. They get to sit on the same table as Poland. They go to China together. So it's, I think, pretty sexy for them. Some data. Trade increase, you can see in 2000 it was very low. It peaked. It's probably even higher today. We don't have data. Anyway, the dip is due to the financial crisis. And of course, you can see the disparity, you can see the deficit. The green line down there is the exports from Balkans to China. This is how it goes by country. And so Serbia and Croatia has most trade. This is the structure of the trade. And as you can see, predominantly, the exports from the Balkans to China are raw materials. You have gold, you have minerals, ferroalloys, and all that. And what you get from China is textile and electronics mostly. So this pretty much illustrates how China sees the Balkans in this sense, and it is very close to the way they see, for instance, Africa or other resource-rich areas. Even though the Balkans is not that resource-rich, still it's a pretty colonial kind of setting. Chinese investment in the Balkans, sorry, 2 more minutes. China has made a lot of investments, primarily in the field of transport, infrastructure, and energy. Of course, there is big data problem, not just because of lack of transparency, which is there, but moreover because Chinese investments do not, especially private investments, are rerouted through Hong Kong and other tax havens. Actually, more than half of the Chinese investment goes through Hong Kong. So it's really difficult to trace it around the globe, and that's not just over here, but more so in the West. Anyway, the big investments, which are all by state-owned enterprises, as you can see, highways, power plants, what else? I mentioned highways. It's important, one of the trademark investments in the Balkans is the coastal power plant, and it was affected by the floods, so I'm not sure what's going there. It's a bad luck because the Chinese had a very successful first round of investment, and then they reinvested again a few years later, and they invested a lot of money. So we'll see what happens. There is, some of them are, okay, we'll skip this classification. The rumors I mentioned, the Budapest-Belgrade Rail, which is actually an announcement rumor. There's heavy interest in Rijeka, in the port in Rijeka, which is also related to this infrastructure idea. There is a rumor in Greece, but actually there's also a feasibility study by one of the biggest Chinese corporations in construction about building canals that would link Danube to the Mediterranean, which I'm personally very skeptical, but Chinese are known for such large-scale projects, which often involve destroying villages and cities on the way. Chinese, as I said, are pretty good at this. They have the experience and they're willing to do projects, and they have a good precedence. For instance, in Macedonia we have Kozjak, which is one of probably the most valuable foreign investments completely done by the Chinese. Other aspects, this is all supporting measures, intensifying diplomatic activity, military cooperation, education, culture, people not so much. Conclusions. Okay, so again, we don't need to panic, because what we didn't see on these slides is that actually, again, China is not the first, not the second, not the third, but rather fifth, sixth, or seventh trading partner. So it's still, important, but not as important as media hype would say it is. it is more part of the changing global system, and in that sense, in a bit of a cynical way, good news because maybe the Balkans is finally becoming part of the world. China does not have the capacity itself and doesn't want to replace traditional powers. So the Balkans, as I said, it's primarily interested in investing its own interests. Though it offers what traditional partners want, and this is money with little political conditionality and tangible outcomes. And here it's important to revoke the African experience. Why China succeeded in Africa is because it offered infrastructure projects instead of aid to develop education or political system and whatnot, which often ended in the pockets of corrupt politicians. So instead you have a highway, it's, people like highways. And at the end of the day, I said, again, not forget, not get too enthusiastic. How does that correlate, how does this relate to the EU prospects of the Balkans? I probably didn't emphasize it enough, but the aspect of being part or port to the common market is really crucial why China would like to trade with the Balkans. So in the sense, any statement that more cooperation with China gets you away from the EU is not really, doesn't really make sense because these countries are, no one wants to do business basically with isolated small countries that themselves are not very promising. The lessons for attracting investments, again, maybe there are not political conditions, but political stability, will, good infrastructure, very important showing that you invest in your own economy, of course battling corruption. What is the caution? Of course, as this is the fear in Europe, here doesn't seem to be a reason for concern. Domestic businesses losing work to the Chinese ones. Further problems with working rights. Environmental deterioration due to lack of respecting standards. Getting traditional partners angry, not in the sense that they would react, but you might lose business with them. Challenges, we have very often populist and sensationalist discourse in the Balkans, which is paired with administrative sloppiness. On the other side, you have technocratic, very systematic, strategic approach by these Chinese bureaucrats. So it's different visions, different cultures. The triangle, as I said, might be, might not be a problem. We had instance of European Trade Commissioner warning the Central European countries not to break away from EU common policy, but then again, that's a chronic problem of EU-China relations. I mean, we have Germany's special relationship. You know, when Merkel goes to Beijing, she doesn't talk about human rights, but rather about business. So it's not, it's a chronic problem of the EU, not something special, but might probably hamper positions in the EU. Anyway, open question is how would this affect especially the enlargement prospect? No one has addressed it ever. What would happen when the Balkan countries need to act on, or in general the Central European countries need to act on geopolitical issues? For instance, a very famous China watcher from Sabo, from European Consular Affairs, said that, for instance, it's only the Central Eastern European countries in their format that could probably influence more active involvement of China in Ukraine. Slovenia itself, an inexperienced foreign policy actor years ago, had problems with Dalai Lama visiting and then issues with China. So what happens when, for instance, Macedonia's president, who's very friendly towards religious leaders, happens to meet the Dalai Lama? Of course, the legacy of Milosevic I mentioned. Currently, Orban, does Orban's anti-democratic tendencies coincide, or they kind of go together with growing Chinese investment and his pro-Chinese orientation? Anyway, these are all questions for discussion.
Okay, please, Tommy.
Okay, and last but not least, I have to ask the question, which to me is really perverted, is would leaders of Central East European countries would take their Chinese guests to the museums of the victims of communism? You know, I think it's it's the elephant in the room, no one talks about it, but if politicians don't talk, maybe we could. And thank you for your attention, sorry for the time.
Okay, so Chinese time goes very slow, slower than Turkish time. Only, yeah, okay, Chinese are oriented towards goals. Serbians work right on time, only 20 minutes. Let's see the Macedonians. Last but not least, we have Professor Hadjianev. He's one of the leading geopolitical experts in Macedonia, if not the leading expert. Please.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, I'm the only one that will not have a presentation for today, and I'm sorry for that, because usually I go with the presentation, but when I asked, then I received yes, no answer, and then I decided to go without. The other thing that I'm going to do right now is to put my military hat on, because we have to finish up, and this is what I usually do when I discuss things with the military professionals and politicians or students, civilian students. I always say there is a difference between military and politicians, and do you know what it is, the difference? Basically, in the goal and the objectives. Usually military says, tell me what is my mission and I will do it. And the politicians say, what are my options? Give me my options so that I know how to calculate. Basically, I will have the mission now to end up in 10 minutes or a little bit longer than that. My approach is slightly different than US, and I am very thankful that I was invited here, because I learned a lot. It's not just pure political theorist approach, it's rather more international security oriented approach that basically starts with more, let's say, understanding the setup of the global political scene, because to the group of the people that I belong, speaking things, relationship, let's say, of such an important matter like EU, China and EU, Turkey is like discussing what is better to use Tylenol or Advil to the fever while the cancer is metastasizing. What I'm trying to say here is that basically my approach will set up the table from geopolitical aspects, what's going on, and then use those drivers to explain how they affect EU, China and EU-Turkish relations. Basically, the globalization, the intensification of the globalization, and the effects that has happened during these processes, along with the technological advance, has shaped pretty much the environment we live now and are still shaping it in a way. Since the liberalism remained as a solid power when communism fell apart, they dominated the scene. However, this domination is not as they have expected. Why? Because it has been stopped in two ways. It has been stopped in basically Middle East, and it has been stopped by the financial crisis and has raised many questions. This to say is that basically put several outcomes. Those outcomes are that I'm not saying that they are influenced or there is a theory behind it, but what I'm saying is that this happened one by another, interrelated and interconnected. So basically, as outcomes, many of the states has lost the monopoly of power. International organization has lost the monopoly of power. We see a rise of a corporate and corporate organization in the influence. And I will name several examples. For example, if you remember what happened when, let's say, UNESCO tried to oppose Palestinian, or tried to support Palestinian, next month, what happened was that, supported by the Israeli lobby and US, they didn't get the salary. So they influenced them, they set back, rolled back the decision about the Palestinian support, etc., etc. So this is the influence that some corporates have actually in terms of making decisions, and that I believe affects basically pretty much not just states but also international organization in approach to one or another way. The other thing is that we are seeing microdynamics that have also strategic impacts, such migration and mixture of, let's say, on demographics, has strategic impacts and has actually an influence policy making in several states. Having said that, is, let's say, if you combine then the, how to say, the value that liberalism and liberal democracy has incorporated or tried to impose to the world is translated into the freedom of movement of people, goods, services, basically has opened the door to non-state actors to move and also to spread their influence. what we see actually is not just the migration in a good sense, but also there are negative effects of that migration that has caused several scholars to argue that one of the arguments about the rising of the right-wing, let's say, extremists in Europe is a result of that migration, because people see a threat that is coming as a result of what has been set up. So basically, in general relations depends on these dynamics. There are differences, and who will prevail depend on how one can adjust to these dynamics. Failure to understand this will affect the results. This is what I believe pretty much in this relation. So EU and China, both EU and China